Hey everyone, Tony D and Little Joan with another hot take. This one is about climate change. The reason I'm doing this one and the tenuous tie to Hollywood is because during the Golden Globes, when people weren't virtue signaling about Trump, they were virtue signaling about the Australian brush fires. Here's the thing about the brush fires. And this happens in California too. If you don't do controlled burning to get rid of the underbrush, you tend to have problems with fires in the summer. You do the controlled burns in the winter or in damper times so they don't get out of control. So when the summer rolls around, most of the stuff that would burn is gone, and so you don't get these giant fires. It's a way to mitigate this kind of damage. Australia, unfortunately, instituted a green policy of not doing that. The environmentalists there, who are pretty extreme, decided, well, you know, brush fires are bad for the environment and climate change, and they're bad for the animals. Well, as it turns out, they were actually good for the animals because you wouldn't have 500,000 animals dead now if you had done enough controlled burns back when you needed to do them. California has this problem too, not nearly as bad. They just don't have the money to really organize it. They try to clear the brush. And when you're talking about millions and millions of square miles of, I don't know if it's millions, I guess it would be hundreds of thousands of square miles. I don't know what the square mileage is of California, but anyhow, when you talk about the woods there, I mean, there's a lot of woods to clear the underbrush and to like physically clear the brush, you know, all the leaves and stuff that would burn in the summer. I mean, that's a lot of work. You just may not have the time when you literally have miles of I mean, it's hard enough to rake I have enough trouble raking the own leaves in my yard. I can't imagine if my yard was like 4 square miles. I mean, you know, I'd need a truck and a few extra workers in a couple of weeks. So imagine an entire state. So, you know, the people panicking about Australia, on top of the fact that it's been reported, and this is true, that 183 people have been arrested for starting fires in Australia. This is the time of year in Australia where the kids are out of school, and they attribute a lot of the fires to just teenagers lighting fires. I guess there's not a whole hell of a lot to do in Australia, or that they're having bonfires, or they're screwing around, or they're, you know, maybe they're riding around on motorcycles or mopeds and they're heating up and driving them through the leaves and igniting the leaves. You know, it only takes a couple of stupid people to do that. I mean, they're smoking, being careless with cigarettes. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to start a fire, especially when you're in a tinderbox in the middle of summer. And, you know, one thing, I know of a person who, they had a car and the cover for their catalytic converter had fallen off, and they drove into a pile of leaves and ignited the leaves. So, you know, things happen. The people who are touting the line that it's climate change is the sole cause, first off, they're discounting all this evidence, and that's pretty major evidence that it's not climate change. I'm going to put Joan down. There you go, Joan. You know, climate change is a factor. I mean, there is, you know, you cannot help but to acknowledge that there are billions of people on the planet, and they obviously are affecting the climate to some degree. But that's not the real question. The real question is it reversible? How much damage is it really doing? And, you know, can we really do anything about it? You know, in the United States, when you line up all the countries that are polluting, the United States is, I think we're like 7th, I want to say. But, you know, our pollution is pretty much under control at this point. We recycle, we have cars that don't emit as much carbon monoxide and carbons into the air. We just have better technology on everything. When you talk about the second world countries like China and India, who they don't have the kind of regulations we do in terms of the air and pollution and water, you know, I'm sure we could probably turn the tide in India fairly easily because they're a democratic country and they're, you know, our buds. But when you're talking China, a communist country, I mean, we can't even get these guys to stop killing their own people. You're going to stop them from throwing sewage into the river and God knows what else they're doing. I mean, if they'll torture their own people, I don't think pollution is really an issue for the Chinese. It's bottom line. So, you know, the Chinese are really doing a lot of damage to the air, and they don't seem to care. They will eventually, you know, when it finally bites them in the ass. The question is, will it bite us in the ass too? The answer is probably not, because the Earth's so big. And what you have to understand is the amount of impact man has had on the Earth. You know, we drove some animals to extinction. That's about the scale we can really measure, you know, in terms of real change on the Earth. You can point to the temperatures rising, but they haven't been recording the history of temperature long enough to totally 100% say with accuracy that, yes, it's only the presence of man that has changed this. I mean, they can look at tree samples and soil samples and get a pretty good idea, but nothing is definitive. And when you look at this Australian situation, when you see that the government was pressured by a group of voters, super greenies, who wanted to stop this controlled burns, now you look at the end result. The end result is they made it worse. This is why you don't want to just suddenly start changing the rules here. You don't want to just suddenly start, you know, saying, okay, nobody can eat meat anymore. That may drastically impact the planet in some way that's unforeseen. And in fact, it would probably be a really bad idea. We'd probably end up, let's say tomorrow they say, okay, no more cows. Can't eat a cow, that's illegal. Well, what are you going to do with all these cows that we already have? Are we going to end up like India, where they're sacred and they're walking around everywhere? You know, the fact that, you know, India, they considered a cow sacred, and they've got a huge problem with the methane that's being released into the air because of the cows. Now imagine, you know, this was part of the new Green Deal, the worry about methane, cow farts. So what if you had a situation of, okay, you force everybody to become vegan. Now the cow population just explodes, and now you have to kill the cows and nobody's even eating them. That would be terrible. That would be far worse than what we're doing now. You know, can you imagine just slaughtering cows and no one eats them? I mean, that would be terrible. So you have to, you know, think these things through. When I was a kid in school in the 70s, we used to see film strips on how the next ice age was coming. And they taught us, you know, if man isn't careful, there's going to be a new ice age and everything's going to be frozen. Well, that turned out to be totally wrong. It was based on flimsy evidence that, well, the weather patterns had changed, and turned out that it was, you know, a decades cycle. It wasn't meant to be taken like, well, now it's just going to keep getting colder and colder and colder until we're back into an ice age. No, it just was a trend at that time. It could very well be that there's a 10,000 year weather cycle that we're unaware of because we haven't really the data recorded. Back in the 80s, a little later, there was a popular book about how the population explosion was going to kill us all. And that went something like, well, the population will grow so big, you know, in order to feed everybody, will be basically, you know, stripping the land and the resources, and the next thing you know, all the food will run out, and we will just all start starving and dying. This was something, and it was presented very much like the climate change debate today. The difference being, you know, back then it was magazines, newspapers, some television, but mostly magazines, newspapers, and some books. And the people who got caught up in this tend to be the overeducated, the people who read a lot. But a lot of people didn't get caught up in it, and they just said, well, you know, we need more data or whatever. But the people who got caught up on it were totally insistent that it was going to happen. But those people didn't have Facebook and social media and constant nonstop coverage to push. And although maybe in the 80s you might have gotten a celebrity to say something about that situation, it wasn't as widespread like now. It wasn't trendy to do. Then we had Al Gore and The Inconvenient Truth, and that turned out to be wrong. You know, we were going to have an ice-free cap, and we're all going to be underwater, and that turned out to be untrue, and that was like, I don't know, 2012, 2014. And now finally we have this climate change debate, and you have celebrities at the Golden Globe going on and on about it like they know something. They're following a trend, in my view, because they're celebrities, and that's what they do. When you're a celebrity, you're vulnerable to public criticism, and especially now via social media, it's better you side with the group you perceive as being the biggest, because you can't go wrong with that. That's why a lot of celebrities stayed away from politics traditionally. That's why they would tend to go with, you know, what the populist view of things was. But with social media, the populist view has become completely distorted. If you follow Twitter, and I do, but I follow it with a very wary eye, you would think that Trump is going to kill us all, climate change is going to kill us all. Like, there's a lot of things that are hyped up on Twitter that are just way overhyped. It's the equivalent of how they overhype Trump. You know, Trump's not the greatest guy in the world. I've criticized him for the drone strike. I think it was a bad idea. But he's not Orange Hitler. He is a president. And where he has done things that I'm sure many of you disagree with, he's not subverting democracy. You know, there's a lot of things he's accused of that just isn't true. You know, the classic example, and I always bring this up, is when he went to see the premier of Japan, and the news showed him dumping a box of food for the koi. And they all criticized Trump, said, oh my God, he dumped the whole box in, what an idiot. How dare he? He probably overfed the fish and he killed them. And then later, the entire footage emerged, and the the Japanese premier went out, dumped an entire box, and then Trump did the same thing. So when you see it in context, you realize, oh, this was just nonsense they were using to hit Trump politically. And that's what I think a lot of the climate change stuff is. It's not really about the science. It's about what the people who are pushing this can get out of it. For the celebrities, it's virtue signaling. It's popularity. It's look how cool I am. I'm not just an actor. I care about koalas too. For other people, for politicians, it's all about votes and, you know, being on the right side of the issue and being against your opponent on something. And for other people, it's just virtue signaling. It's just, oh, look how woke I am. I care about the koalas, you know. I sent $10 to this group that's going to save the koala bear. You know, and that's all well and good, but to be constantly preached about it and to not acknowledge that this issue is more complicated than just saying, hey, everybody, we have to do more just because you're upset right now, and just because right now it's trendy to be upset, isn't really the way you do things. And it's not a reason to change society and let's say, the way we recycle, because you could end up like the Australians, making the situation much worse. And you have to lay those 500,000 animals on the doorstep of these environmentalists, these do-gooders. I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And, you know, environmentalists in Australia, you really have to look hard in the mirror and say to yourselves, wow, we got this one wrong, and we really messed up. Because if you don't, you're going to do it again and again. This is going to happen next year. You have to start doing your controlled burns again. And you have to realize that that's part of being a good steward of the environment. And if you don't, well, you're really much worse than these corporations you supposedly oppose.